warm welcome to all of you tuning into this conversation on human rights in Iran. I'm Alex Blair, Communications Manager at Garden Court North Chambers in Manchester, England. You all know how serious and pressing the topic under discussion today is, and I'm grateful for you for taking the time to learn more about it from a true expert. Professor Javaid Rehman is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. An honorary role that he held for 6 years until 2024. Javaid's also a professor of law at Brunel University, London, an associate member of Garden Court North, and the voice of Global Authority on Muslim constitutionalism and international human rights law. Taking on the mantle of interviewer today will be Pete Weatherby, KC, founding member of Garden Court North Chambers. Pete is a leading silk on inquests, public inquiries from COVID-19 to Hillsborough, and an expert on international humanitarian and human rights law, pursuing cases to the UN Human Rights Committee and more. Now, this conversation is obviously pre-recorded, but both Javaid and Pete are more than willing to answer any questions that you may have about what's discussed today. Please direct these to my email address, which you'll find enclosed in the email containing this video. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Alex. And hi, Javaid. Professor Rehman, welcome. And for the next 45 minutes or an hour, we're going to discuss your work, as Alex said, as Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Iran. And of course, you held that post for the maximum of 2 terms, which I think was 6 years. And you completed your tour in July 2024. Now, just to let people watching know, I'm talking to you from Manchester and you're talking to me from Canberra. And that might mean we'll have some communication difficulties, not of our own making, but we'll do our best. Now, being Special Rapporteur of such a mandate was always going to be a really tough gig, wasn't it, Javaid? But it really did turn out that way in the end, and very challenging, didn't it? I know at the end of your mandate, your parting shot was to publish your report entitled Atrocity Crimes, and that didn't leave much to the imagination. And that was a report which detailed crimes against humanity committed in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution between about 81 and 82, and of course the massacres of political prisoners, primarily in jails, in 1988, didn't it? And that was summary, arbitrary, extrajudicial killings, and most commentators seem to have settled on a figure of around 30,000 people being killed. And apart from chronicling what actually happened, your call essentially was one of accountability and a call for justice. I'm sure we'll discuss that at some more detail later in this conversation. But before we do, can you just tell us what the response of the Iranian authorities to that report and to your work more generally? What actually was the personal effect on you of this job?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Thank you for this important question to begin with. So, unfortunately, the Iranian authorities, throughout the 6 years that I held the mandate, became increasingly non-cooperative and hostile towards me. But as you rightly mentioned, once I exposed the regime in my final findings in July 2024, which, as you've mentioned, that my findings were that the regime and senior members of the regime had committed atrocity crimes, including summary, arbitrary, and extrajudicial executions of thousands of arbitrarily imprisoned political opponents, amounting to crimes against humanity, of murder and extermination, torture and forced disappearances, as well as genocide between 1979 and 1988, and in particular during the 1988 massacre. The response was shocking because the regime organized a smear campaign. They launched that smear campaign against me with completely false, fabricated, and malicious allegations of bias, fraud, corruption, and being complicit in terrorism. The regime and its proxies also threatened to harm me personally. While the regime, and again, its proxies, were not able to challenge me on the accuracy or the substance of this report, the entire purpose of the smear campaign was to put me under enormous pressure, discredit me and my integrity and my commitment to seek justice for the victims. And of course, I would like to mention to you a little bit more, if you would allow me, about why was it that the regime suddenly launched this this atrocious smear campaign. If you would want me to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. But could we perhaps come back to that in due course? I mean, I think the personal threats were pretty shocking, but the smear campaign against you was effectively that you've been paid to create propaganda against the regime rather than do what your mandate was, which was to look at the facts and report on them. And in doing so, I think you repeatedly gave the opportunity to the Islamic Republic to first of all invite you to Iran itself, but also for them to comment on matters. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, that has always been the case, that I have, ever since I took the mandate in 2018, I've been requesting them to allow me to visit the country, a request that they denied, and unfortunately, I did not have access to Iran. But also, when I was writing all of my reports, I was expected to write 2 reports every year, one for the General Assembly and one for the Human Rights Council. Each time I invited them, and they would not comment on the substance other than saying, oh, that this is a biased, prejudicial report, and I have been paid to write this report, as you were just saying, that the smear campaigns was always there.
Yeah, it's quite difficult, isn't it, to present work such as that if the people that you're reporting on won't even answer the questions or won't provide the evidence for you. Can I go back to the start, Javaid, and just discuss how you got there to that position? As Alex introduced you, of course, you're a professor of law, specialist in international human rights law, Muslim constitutionalism. But how do you get from that, the day job at Brunel, to being a UN Special Rapporteur? How did that land on your desk?
Thank you, Pete. I am from Pakistan. I'm a Pakistani lawyer. And I had the great fortune of working closely with one of the leading human rights lawyers from Pakistan, Asma Jahangir. Asma was my immediate predecessor as the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran. But unfortunately and very sadly, she passed away in February 2018. She was only into her second year of this mandate. And her untimely death led me to the belief that I must now take additional responsibilities. And therefore, I took the opportunity to submit my application to the Human Rights Council in April of 2018. So that is how I got into this role of independent.
Recognizing that you had the relevant expertise and you were pretty ideally placed to take over the mantle from Asma. Is that the way it was?
Yeah, I looked at the criterion, and I will just briefly explain. I mean, I'm very senior and very serious human rights activist, and I looked at the nature of the role of the special rapporteur on Iran. And I looked at the requirements, which are, in essence, the expertise, experience, the independence, personal integrity and objectivity and impartiality. and I believe that I could take on Iran, which is a very challenging mandate, but I felt that I could do that, and that's why I submitted my application.
Yeah, can you help us then? Not everybody watching this will know everything about the role. The role of a special rapporteur. First of all, it's an unpaid role, and it forms part of the special procedures of the UN's Human Rights Council, doesn't it? But can you just help us with who, in general terms, special rapporteurs are and what the special procedures are aimed at?
Yes. So the special rapporteur, which I was until July last year, on the human rights situation in Iran, forms part of this, what we call it as the special procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And the special procedures are effectively individuals who like me, are appointed by the council for their specialist knowledge, expertise, impartiality, personal integrity, and objectivity. And these individuals, depending on the nature of the mandate, are called independent experts. So contrary to this, we as independent experts are neither the employees of the United Nations, nor are we paid. So it is a voluntary exercise, and that does add quite considerable workload, working purely on an honorary basis. And if I can just add that, and I think you've already mentioned that the maximum term for any individual as special rapporteur is for 6 years.
Yeah. How do they come about? There are specific mandates. So I think the concern about human rights in Iran itself is one of the oldest of the mandates, I think, if I'm right, and it dates from 1984. But how is there a special rapporteur for human rights in Iran and a special rapporteur for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, for example, but not for some other countries? How does it come about?
Yes, you see, it's a mandate and it's a prerogative of the members of the United Nations represented in the Human Rights Council. So if a country or if a territory is particularly challenging, as you mentioned, the OPT mandate, Iran mandate, and there are several other country-specific mandates, if there are serious challenges posed in those territories or the countries themselves, then if the council is so minded, and if there is sufficient consensus, and obviously bringing consensus is very challenging, as you know, it can be a very deeply divisive issue.
Yeah.
So if there is sufficient consensus, then there could be country mandates, like, for example, in the case of Iran. And you're absolutely right that was one of the oldest mandate. But as you know, that between 1984 to 2002, this mandate continued. But then it was stopped until it was reestablished in 2011.
Why was that, Javaid? Why was that? Why was it stopped?
Yeah, it is because the Iranian regime was able to convince at that time what was then the Human Rights Commission, the members of the commission, that there was no longer the need for a specific country mandate. Various initiatives were advanced, various promises were made, democratic governance, respect for human rights, etc., etc. And again, as I say, it is a prerogative for what was then the Human Rights Commission and now the Human Rights Council to see whether there is a need for a specific mandate. In this case, the Iran mandate.
So it's actually the Human Rights Council and the members of it that decide on when there should be a mandate and indeed when the mandate might come to an end.
Yes, indeed, it is a decision of the Human Rights Council, and it is through their understanding of the situation that they could establish or de-establish.
So your role as special rapporteur is to look into and seek out what human rights abuses or complaints there might be, and to provide advice to the Human Rights Council, but also to produce reports, as you've indicated, but you've also given speeches and reports, for oral reports, to the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, and indeed to the United Nations Security Council, UNSC. How does that work generally with special rapporteurs? What's the purpose of reporting back to UNGA and the UNSC?
As you rightly mentioned, if you look at the establishes a particular mandate, it also identifies what the mandate holder is broadly expected to do. So, in my case, I was asked to present my findings to the Human Rights Council in the March session, and the UN General Assembly in October. So these are the primary obligations.
Yeah.
But in addition, as you rightly mentioned, because of the sensitivity of issues, I also made representations. I was invited by the United Nations Security Council at the height of the Women, Life, Freedom movement,
yeah,
to give them information about the crisis that the human rights the human rights community was facing in Iran, and the suffering of the girls and women in the country. So it's my responsibility to react to every situation.
Yeah.
And if I can also add that once I noticed in 2022 that women and girls were being brutalized, it was my moral as well as a legal obligation to actually think about avenues, how to promote and protect girls and women in particular. So I took the lead in campaigning for an accountability mechanism. And then the Human Rights Council invited me to make my presentation and make my findings known to the members. And I was very grateful to the Human Rights Council because they listened to me, and they listened to the international community more broadly, to the non-governmental organizations, and they set up an international fact-finding mission in 2022, which is now thankfully still operative, and the council just last month broadened its scope. So, in that sense, my work is, it can be very broad, and I can take responsibility for all of the human rights situation in the country.
So there's also a legacy part to it. So you have standard duties, if you like, of reporting to the Human Rights Council and to UNGA, but then you have a further mandate to seek out issues and complaints and to investigate them, and then on specific issues you have raised and been invited to go to the UNSC. So that's the kind of organic way it works. And I was going to move on to ask you about the 2022 Women, Life, Freedom movement, and I will do, but then that triggered a wider interest, and that's how you came before the Security Council. So it's very much a role of what you make it as Special Rapporteur, and of course, as you say, that then has led to a legacy, and I hope we can go on and discuss that in a few moments. But over the 6 years that you did, there was a particularly tumultuous period of many different violations of human rights in Iran. But do you want to just point up a couple of those to us?
Yeah, so you're right. The 6 years that I was mandate holder, it was a very unfortunate and tragic period. There's massive amount of violations of human rights. Just to identify one or two, areas of deep concern. One was the November 2019 protests, whereby a very large number of men, women, and children were murdered by security forces. And the problem, Peter, I hope we will have some time to talk about it, but the problem is the absence of any kind of accountability in the system. All the powers are concentrated with very few people, led by the supreme leader. So there has been no accountability. There's been no action taken as to what has happened. Why so many people were killed, brutally killed by security forces within a space of a week. And then if you follow it up by what happened in 2020, in January, there was a downing of the Ukrainian airliner PS752, which killed everyone on board, 176 persons. Again, there has been no justice served to those victims and their families, and they're still waiting for that to happen.
Yeah.
And finally, within those 6 years, as we've been talking about this women life freedom movement, that was an unprecedented movement that took place, and therefore the responsibility lies on the shoulders of the mandate holder to actually highlight the nature, the egregious forms of violations of human rights that occurred during this movement and the killing of Gina Massa in September
that's really
2022.
That's really what sparked the movement, wasn't it? The killing of Gina Massa Amini.
Yeah.
And that was in September of
absolutely.
2022. And what was your role thereafter? You obviously identified that as a key moment, and the movement that sprang up as a result of that. And what did you do?
Yeah, so this unfortunate killing of Gina Massa Amini, there was a build-up, because as soon as the former President Ibrahim Raisi came to power, he started, and his regime started oppressing women even further. So there were a number of incidents that were taking place. Raisi was adamant to pressurize and brutalize women. So when Gina Massa, she was a Kurdish young woman, when she was killed in Tehran, there was an immediate spontaneous reaction, and I had to respond to that. And I felt that this was the time when we had to raise our voice to say, well, enough is enough in terms of violations and brutalization of women that has been going on since 1979. So, you know, the violations in that case of really using force against girls and women who do not adhere to this draconian law of hijab, you see. And I raised my voice before the UN General Assembly to say,
I was going to go on. I was going to go on about that, Javaid, because very, very quickly. I mean, the killing I think was in September, and by October you were there before the General Assembly raising this as a major issue, which gave it much greater prominence with a you know, the official seal, if you like, of a special rapporteur. And what came of that? What came of the General Assembly in October?
Yeah. You see, Pete, normally General Assembly and other international fora, it's a very kind of a diplomatic environment. But I felt that, you know, the atrocities and the brutalization that had taken place in the case of Gina Massa, and the way the regime there was a established cover-up by the regime of saying, well, nothing has happened, you know. Oh, that was a pure accident and all that, and then they were arresting lots of people and started you know, repressing any movement. So between September of that year, when Gina Massa was killed, to October, I gathered a lot of information, and I was convinced that this matter has to be raised before the General Assembly, and it has to be raised to say that there must now be an accountability mechanism, because the regime was hiding a lot of critical information. We offered them international observers and monitors to go and see and investigate why Gina Massa Amini died in the way that she did, and they refused it. So I had no choice but to say that we must now have an international accountability mechanism. And I must say I was the first voice in the General Assembly to raise this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that the as you say, the General Assembly can be very much a diplomatic talking shop, some would say, but on occasion it really steps up, doesn't it? And also provides a forum. I mean, we've had the very recent example of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, where UNGA has referred the aid situation to the ICJ. And we've had the ongoing cases there. So it's quite an interesting series of mechanisms, I think, isn't it? But from October, you then invited to the UN Security Council in November, I think. And then following from that, the accountability mechanism that you were just about to tell us about, from that then it was set up. Who actually set up the fact-finding mission for Iran?
Yeah, so in October, I made this presentation to the UN General Assembly, and the movement actually was, it was unprecedented, and the brutality coming from the regime was also unprecedented. I mean, they killed dozens of very young people. In fact, if I remember correctly, that the UN Committee on Child Rights, they acknowledged that dozens of very young people, children, were killed by the regime in a very short space of time. So the momentum of the movement and the crisis actually led the international community to seek more information, and I was very active at that time. And the UN Security Council then, because as you know, the role of the Security Council is a threat to peace and security. So it became such an issue that, in fact, it was a threat to peace and security as identified by the Security Council. Yeah. So thereby I went to them and I said, look, the international community must take action. So that was the first step. And then the matters came back to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Because myself and the human rights community and many states were campaigning for the establishment of an investigative mechanism post the Women, Life, Freedom movement, the starting of the movement. And therefore, a momentum was built. And if I can just say that on the 22nd of November, the Human Rights Council convened a special session. And it was the first time ever in the history of Iran that they decided to set up a fact-finding mission focused on what we informed the council, that there were gross and grave crimes being committed against the people of Iran. So that was a big achievement, I would say, in terms of accountability.
A massive achievement, given the extremely slow pace at which UN bodies often work at. I mean, to have gone from September to getting this fact-finding mission established by the Human Rights Council in November was a really tremendous achievement. So going forward from that, the fact-finding mission to Iran is set up. And what happens then? So post-November, what progress does the fact-finding mission make?
The fact-finding mission has been very active. They are, and again, we're thankful to the international community, to the Human Rights Council. They have a well-resourced mission, and they have produced very substantial amount of documentation and reports documenting the crimes that have been committed and the serious atrocities. And the fact-finding mission, like myself, have taken the view that crimes against humanity have taken place, and there must be accountability, and that these people must be held to account. So a lot of important work has been done. And as I said, the Human Rights Council just last month extended both the mandate and the scope, because previously the fact-finding mission was focusing on the life freedom movement and issues related to that. But now, they are going to be reporting to the UN mechanisms about the violations of human rights that have taken place and are being taken place in the country.
So the fact-finding mission is to chronicle what happened, presumably take evidential reports from witnesses and people involved. And no doubt the Iranian authorities have been once again invited to make their comments. But then the reports that you refer to, the documents that you refer to the fact-finding mission making, they then go through the UN processes and lead on to other potential avenues. Is that really the purpose of it?
Yeah. So the fact-finding mission, as its as the names is mentioning, it looks at the facts and it comes to certain observations and conclusions, and it has a process of gathering the documentation, gathering the evidence, and the ultimate objective is to highlight the key violations, the key crimes, and including the crimes against humanity, which individuals have committed or are involved in committing. And therefore, the next stage is that to use that documentation and evidence to hold these individuals accountable.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to do that, isn't it? The International Criminal Court, for example, has no mandate in Iran. So the existence of international processes beyond the ones that you've described is quite difficult, isn't it? I mean, the pressure to bear on Iran is a long-term one, isn't it?
And that is the problem, that a regime such as the Iranian regime, they thrive on repression, they thrive on brutality, and they know that there will be no accountability so long as they remain in control. And that's why they have been, since 1979, they have been violating all forms of human rights. And as we discussed earlier, that they have committed the worst crimes. And my final findings was that precisely, that the crimes against humanity and genocide and torture and enforced disappearances were committed at a very large scale. And yet accountability has not taken place.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that really as a final part of our conversation. But in more general terms, Iran has an appalling record of arbitrary taking of life and arbitrary and unlawful imprisonment. And it's, I think, per capita, it's the largest executioner of all countries. That's right, I think, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. Just last year, it is reported, and we have to remember that there are no official figures that come out of Iran, but we know from established, recognized sources that over 900 persons were executed just last year. And the tragedy is that Iran continues to execute juveniles. They execute a very large number of women, possibly the largest number of women in the world. Yeah. And then they have public executions. They have executions conducted through torture-driven confessions, and they disproportionately target ethnic and religious minorities. And I've seen many times that in my view and in my
there is real ethnic discrimination within Iran and certain, but not all, minorities. It's quite a complex picture, isn't it?
They are only interested in promoting the Shia elite, and even there, it's a group which wants to dominate, the Shia group. So all other groups, even non-Shia Muslims, are discriminated. So, for example, the Balochis and the Kurds are targeted, and their rights are consistently violated. But then there are other religious minorities, like the largest non-recognized minorities, the Baha'is. And the Baha'is have faced worst forms of human rights violations over the last 4 decades.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted you to help us with that really, because under the Constitution, Iran purports to protect the rights of Christians and Jews as well as Zoroastrians and obviously Muslims, or particularly Shia. But then you have these non-recognized religious minorities. In practice, is there a big distinction between those religious beliefs or religious heritages and those which aren't recognized?
Yeah, you see, the Constitution is very arbitrary, as you rightly say. Article 13 recognizes Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians as the only recognized religious minorities. It does not mean that there's no discrimination against Christians or Jews or Zoroastrians. In fact, there is a lot of persecution, particularly of the Jews. But if we talk about the other religious minorities, I mean, as I just mentioned about the case of the Baha'is, or the Christian converts, or the Sufis, they are the worst of the lot, because there is all forms of persecution. I mean, Baha'i faith is not recognized at all. And as the largest non-Muslim and non-recognized minorities, they have, and I've observed that very closely, they have suffered from the most egregious forms of human rights violations. For example, executions, persecution, deprivation of property rights, even desecration and destruction of their cemeteries. They're denied educational rights. So it is a real painful exercise to look at the situation of Baha'is in Iran.
And why is that? Why is there even different levels of discrimination between the different minorities, or towards the different
that's
minorities?
it's
a historical
issue. It's I think if you look at the psyche of the regime, they try to exploit individuals, So the case of Baha'is is very tragic, but they somehow connect the Baha'is to their ongoing conflict with Israel, you see. And on many occasions, they have said that the Baha'is are actually, this is not a religion. They are actually kind of fifth column. They are supporting Israel. They want to destroy Iran. And therefore, they target the Baha'is in the worst form possible. So it is their psychology. But there are other minorities that are also persecuted. Like, for example, as a Christian, if I am Persian and if I want to change my religion to Christianity or any other religion, it's not permissible. So there is death penalty for blasphemy and apostasy. And throughout the 6 years, I came across many Christians who were consistently persecuted because they had decided to become Christians, and the state, the wrath of the state was upon them, and sometimes they're charged with national security offenses, persecuted, targeted. So it is a very depressing state for any group, any follower of any religion other than the Shia faith.
Yeah. Finally, Javaid, you've highlighted some of your major achievements during the 6 years of your tenure, particularly as we've discussed your involvement, very swift involvement in the women, life and freedom movement issues, but also the atrocity crimes reports that we've discussed. You've left a legacy to your successor. What does the future hold, do you think? Where can the United Nations mechanisms and your successor take the work that you've done to try to change the situation in Iran? What is the way forward?
So I think one thing is that there is continuing impunity of members of the Iranian regime. As I mentioned, since 1979, we have seen atrocities. We saw the massacre of 1988, where thousands of political prisoners were arbitrarily, summarily, and extrajudicially executed. There has been no accountability for all of these crimes against humanity and what we call it as genocide. So I believe that there must be justice and accountability as a starting point. So we have to work on that. I mean, the way the current framework, the constitutional framework and the legal and constitutional setup is established, I am very pessimistic about reform that will satisfy the human rights requirements. So, it is very important that there is rule of law, there is democratic governance, there is constitutionalism. And in the current constitutional framework, as I've come to this conclusion, that it's not possible. So there have to be quite radical changes in the way the state is governed. Currently, all of the governance powers are concentrated in the hands of the supreme leader, and he picks and chooses a lot of his appointees. So I think that the international community must exert pressure on reform, on the agenda of reform. That is important. On the front of rights of girls and women, again, it is a very tragic situation. The Iranian system must respect the fundamental dignity and the fundamental rights of women and girls. I've called them out. I've said that there is gender apartheid, and if we had more time, I could explain that. But what needs to be done is that girls and boys, men and women, they must have complete equality. They must be given equal rights. And I say that as a Muslim. And I say that because there are 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And it is only a handful of these regimes which exploit religion to violate the dignity of girls and women. So I would say that this is not an Islamic trait to what the regime is doing. They have to respect fundamental rights. And a key indicator would be for them to accept and ratify without reservations the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I think that would be the starting point. On the point of religious discrimination, again, Iran has accepted international standards, most prominently through the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, whereby it is fundamental that they end the religious and ethnic discrimination, and they comply with their international obligations as per the International Covenant and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I would say, as I just recommended, the CEDAW Convention must be ratified, and also the Convention Against Torture, which is a very important convention, must also be ratified and implemented by Iran.
And of course, I could add to that the optional protocols to make them at least enforceable in part.
Definitely, yeah. The optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights would be a momentous step forward, because that optional protocol, the prohibition of the death penalty, would save a lot of lives, which I have come to the conclusion that all executions in Iran are arbitrary deprivations of life. So we have to pressurize Iran to accept the optional protocol prohibits the death penalty.
I mean, they're not on their own, are they, Iran, in terms of egregious human rights violations? But also they're not on their own in not ratifying international treaties and bodies to enforce rights. I mean, it brings to mind a conversation I had with the Interior Minister of Bahrain, and he asked me whether I would take part in training security forces in Bahrain in human rights and human rights compliance. And I said to him, well, I would consider it if Bahrain would sign the optional protocol so that individual human rights complaints. I'm afraid his response was to laugh at me. And to this day, Bahrain hasn't done that, and I haven't partaken in their human rights training either. But it's just as a little aside, really. But in terms of international pressure, that really is something within existing frameworks that might lead to some kind of significant change. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and you're absolutely spot on, Pete, that regimes such as the Iranian regime are not the only ones which have this history and contemporary violations of human rights. In fact, they take comfort. They have a good group, what we can call it, a solid group of rogue regimes which work together. And therefore, you mentioned Bahrain, but there are many others in the Middle East, and there are many others across the world who continue to violate human rights. And therefore, it is a struggle for us. It is upon us to keep working at it and to ensure that there is greater respect for human rights, there is greater respect for all people, regardless of their faith and their gender and their background or identity. And if I can just say that it isn't just the Middle East or the developing world. There are many concerns of human rights violations as we are witnessing in the developed world. So we must be vigilant to keep working at it and keep promoting human rights wherever we are.
On that note, Professor Javaid Rehman, thank you very much indeed for a really interesting conversation and for the work that you do. Thanks very much.
And that brings today's discussion to a close. Some powerful stories and calls to action and reflection on the current and future state of human rights in Iran. Javaid, Pete, thank you very much. Thanks to you viewers as well. You'll be able to watch this video on demand when you like, and you can find some of the resources referenced today, including Javaid's landmark report and address to the UN Human Rights Council enclosed, along with my email address to send over any questions, as I mentioned earlier. But for now, thank you very much, and until the next time.